So let's like get into this. I'm gonna ask stuff, I guess, because I kind of have to direct this.
Yes,
Um,
this is your thing.
we
I'm
we
just
kind of
here.
yeah, and I think this all kind of stemmed from I was just so done and like emotional, and I had been trying to figure out how to do this vlog, and I was like, I don't want to cry in it, like I don't want to be super emotional. But at the same time, I was like, there's just so many thoughts in my head. There's no way I can narrow it down, right? You're familiar with this feeling, yes, Lucy?
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. So yeah, so when I started talking to Lucy and she was asking me about it, and we started talking about ableism and what that looks like in our day-to-day life and what we have to worry about in our day-to-day lives and where we work, how we socialize, and Lucy brought up something that's super important, and she started talking about employment.
Yeah.
You want to take over?
Sure. So that's a big thing for me. So I work currently in before after school childcare. And previously, I also worked as a special education assistant, I guess you could call it. I'm in Nova Scotia, so we have different names for stuff down here. But, and it's just sort of, there were times that when I was dealing with situations, particularly with autistic kids, where I really wished I could have actually talked to them and been. I literally had a kid who reminded me a lot of me when I was her age, who was talking to me like, I'm probably the only autistic person you've ever met, right? And I had that exact same conversation with people when I was her age. I so badly wanted to say, actually, I'm autistic too, and actually be able to talk. And because having someone who I already knew, who I, saw in a professional setting doing an actual adult proper job, would have meant so much to me as a kid, because it was such a negative, and it still is quite a negative thing, and we can get into that later. For me, we're both still dealing with a lot of internal trying to, I guess, accept it and be okay with being autistic. It's not that I'm ashamed of it.
Into that.
Yeah, it's not, I'm not ashamed of it, but it's like the world has taught me that I should be. And it became so frustrating that I couldn't talk about that sort of thing to my employers, because if I say I have that, I might get fired. And although it is illegal in most places to be fired for that sort of thing, it's also very hard to prove that someone fired you because you disclosed your disability to them. And then you just have to go through like a big court case, and I mean, at the end of the day, it's just easier to just pretend, which we're all very used to doing. And one thing that I really thought about, I've moved sites since then, but another kid I worked with who has ADHD, I also have ADHD. I have no problem talking about that because I don't have no one connects that to me being able to do things or just to be mentally able to, be involved in the situation. Like, a lot of I feel like parents, again, the whole thing of I don't know if parents would necessarily be okay with me looking after their kids if they knew that I'm autistic and I have an autism diagnosis. They don't care if I have ADHD. And I was able to have a really good conversation with a kid about our struggles with ADHD because he had a lot of the same issues that I did. And that was something that made me realize how frustrated I am that I can't just be open and honest about my autism. And, I mean, that stems all the way back from my diagnosis. It really, over the years, has just built up. I think we were kind of talking, because you kind of felt the same thing, right? Like, it's built up over the years, this big internalized thing of still thinking there's something, like, wrong with me, but it's, like, I know on different levels that, like, being autistic isn't a bad thing. There's so many great things about it. And honestly, I'm thankful for a lot of it. I've been able to meet a lot of really great people and have a lot of really great experiences. I think in my job, especially when I'm working with kids, whether they're autistic or they have other issues, it's really allowed me to see from different perspectives and actually connect with them on a better level because I was that kid. And I also had so many teachers and caregivers and stuff that just didn't even try to help me because I was just an issue,
Yeah. Yeah, I think as someone who's like taught kids to dance, I think when you make a connection with a kid, whether they're, diagnosed, pre-diagnosis, there's something really incredibly special with that
I'm just
bond.
gonna go back to my
And
knitting because I can't stay still,
you,
Autism,
but
hello.
you can, do you, I don't know, when other people, I feel like they're the kids that are labeled as the problem kids, or the kids that other people have issues connecting to.
Yeah.
And I instinctively know exactly what they're feeling and thinking, and they're doing something bizarre to anyone else, and I can understand why.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I was when I used to work at a overnight summer camp. I did a lot of one-on-ones, is what we call them, and people would always say to me you don't need to always go and deal with the problem kids, Lucy. And I was like, I know what it's like to be a problem kid, and it sucks. Can I swear? I'm gonna end up swearing at some point.
I'm swearing.
Anyway,
all bets are off.
It sucks.
We wouldn't.
It sucks to be labeled as a problem kid. And it's especially when everyone's against you. I had one teacher in the second grade who really turned things around for me. And before then, my entire schooling education was horrible. And I don't know how much worse it would have gotten without having him there to actually... He was the first adult that was out of my family that looked at me as, just another kid that needed a little extra help, as opposed to a problem, and if you just ignore it, it'll go away. Which is not...
And I think...
not how you should deal with kids.
No. And I think, we've discussed, I think I'm really lucky. I think I got a very different experience from, a lot of my autistic friends, because my mother and my brother are also on the spectrum. So I grew up in a place, in a house, where everyone, it wasn't necessarily the same diagnosis, but everyone kind of understood. I was never told not to flap or not to rock or, any of that, which so many kids were. And I think a lot of friends that would come over felt a lot more at ease, because they knew that this was a safe place. It was somewhere that they could be themselves, and they weren't they could let their guards down a little bit more. Sometimes I think even more than at home, and not be questioned or looked at oddly.
Yeah. I do kind of wish that I'd known you when I was younger.
I think the employment thing is super important, because I think there is a huge fear of, I used to always say, I'm not out to everyone. I used to always say, whether or not I'm out of, the autistic closet, because it's a very similar thing. Whether you want to be outed, whether you don't want to be outed, and, when you do it, do you have an issue with that? Because I never know. It's a fine line of being well, I don't feel like I'm being myself, but also they're going to think this is a really big personal thing that I don't share with everyone, and I'm not open about, so I'm going to seem really weird if I do.
I mean, I think it depends. I mean, for me personally, as we were talking about earlier before we started recording, I have had a lot of issues in the past with being outed without my consent. Especially when I first got diagnosed in elementary school, everybody in my grade, everyone in the school knew, everybody knew I was autistic. And that wasn't something I had any power over, and that kind of sucked, because that's not something that should... I mean, it was still in the early stages. I mean, nowadays, when I work in classrooms, we have, in a class of 20 kids, usually we're going to have at least 5 kids that have various diagnoses, right? And even now, even as I'm doing this now, I feel a bit of trepidation, because, if someone who, I mean, in one of my jobs, I have talked to my supervisor about it, and that took a year of working in this job already, and talking to my coworkers and stuff, and finally going, okay, I can talk to her about it, and I did, and that really helped. And she was very helpful with that, and she didn't treat me any differently afterwards, which is what I wanted. The whole point of me, if I'm coming out as a disabled person, I don't want you to treat me differently. I just want you to be aware that this is my situation.
Yeah, I think too, I definitely get the trepidation factor, because part of the reason I started this, because I was so sick of there being so much information out there that's just wrong, but also so little information. I think people really like to jump on the the oh yeah, against ableism train kind of thing, but I don't see people sharing much about it. And when they do, I find it's not necessarily from a disabled person. And I think with like that specific minority, I think as like a disabled person, I think for some reason it's seen that this minority can't speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Which is ridiculous. We have so much to say. You're gonna see in a second.